Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here with all of you and with Nathan Chappell. Nathan, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So we have a really good group in the in LinkedIn on the chat. I just asked everybody, Nathan, you're gonna laugh, but I asked people to post a comment with an A if they do think there's a generosity crisis, or B if they don't. It's a little bit clickbaity, but I think we're both genuinely interested in seeing what people think about this.
For sure. Yeah. No, it's an interesting topic, and it's also been interesting how that answers to that question probably have evolved over time.
Mm-hmm.
Where in the beginning, we started talking about this subject a couple of years ago, it was like, why are you even talking about it? How dare you? To, I think this weekend I saw 3 different articles on LinkedIn around aspects of the generosity crisis. So
Wow, yeah, I know. So that's amazing. I'm gonna put these on this screen. So sorry for this digression. Welcome everybody. I was just I get overexcited. But welcome to DPP Office Hours, where this is a regular series of interview that we do as part of the donor participation project that Nathan here and so many of you so kindly support. Of course, we talk about donor participation because we think there's kind of an issue. So that's the bias today. But Nathan so very kindly agreed to join us. He has an executive role with DonorSearch, but he also does his own research, and he has a long history of doing research in the nonprofit sector. So Nathan, would you be kind enough to share a little bit about your background with us?
yeah. Well, thanks again for having me. I've been so impressed by you, Luis, how you've just like really managed to grab hold of a really interesting group of a community on LinkedIn and bring people together is just awesome. And I'm trying to figure out where I can get one of those sweet T-shirts that you always are sporting. So maybe when I see you in New York, I can bribe you for one. But thank you again. I'm very humbled to be here. So Nathan Chappell, like you said, I'm formerly at DonorSearch as a senior vice president overseeing the AI division. My background, though, is a little interesting because I spent 20 years in the nonprofit side. Never intended to. I actually started and sold to tech companies when I was younger, when I had a lot more energy, I guess, and I was fearless. Got into nonprofit on accident, like a lot of people do. Spent 20 years raising money for incredible organizations, starting out at Boys and Girls of America. So really boots on the ground. When you learn how to fundraise when you've got 30 people to pay and you're the last one to get paid, and so you're, chasing Mercedes. Essentially, it was my first early in my career, and then moved into UC San Diego as associate vice chancellor, did consulting with CCS, and then ended up getting into AI actually when I was at City of Hope, which is a 100-plus-year-old cancer hospital, was formerly a tuberculosis sanatorium, and pretty large scale fundraising, about $175 million a year, pretty sophisticated team. And it afforded me the opportunity to sit back and look more holistically of like what's going on and why does it seem like it's getting harder to raise money all these years, um, and being able to look at what technology was essentially available that would allow us to work smarter, not harder. So full cycle back into the technology side, working in a technology company, but only with nonprofits, and essentially looking at what is driving fundraising success.
That's amazing. So you mentioned you mentioned AI, and you said you got into this. How was that path, and what led you to think about AI as a solution? And I'm running another informal poll. Who has lived through Dollars Up, Donors Down?
Yeah, Dollars Up, Donors Down. It's just an interesting kind of, I guess, story where, I was raising money for 20 years and getting, to the level of, when you're raising 175 million a year, 200 million a year, you have the ability to really look, you have specialists in different areas, from annual giving to major giving and so on. And we were seeing some things work and some things just being really challenged, in this scale. Like we were trying to scale up our fundraising and truly, we were buying models, like we were buying predictive models that were essentially logistic regression models from reputable companies, and this is like most of my career buying these models. All the stress of getting all your data prepared, getting it ready, people freaking out, feeling like it has to be perfect, but it's never perfect. And then the model comes out and it's kind of like free for all. Everyone takes the best scores, they put them in their portfolios. There's a little bit of excitement. And then literally every time it was like 6 months later, 8 months later, 10 months later, we're back to like, knife fights in the hallway around like, I don't have any prospects. And so it's this vicious cycle. Prospect development gets blamed. It's like, well, we got to do another model. The last company we used didn't work, so we got to do something new. And gosh, it's just like this like vortex that throughout my career was just over and over again. And I think I just got to the point I'm like, there has to be a better way. People are complicated. People are multidimensional. People's interest changes every day. And at the same time, we know examples of places we buy products from, like, Amazon, just to name one of thousands, that seem to know us more intimately in real time. And so this is 2017, decided to just go for it. And we built 3 different machine learning models, 3 different companies, one in New York, one in Palo Alto, and then one, I hired a couple PhDs to spend about 1.5 years to build our first model. And what we found out, which was, but we found out that people don't give because they're wealthy, no duh. But we were able to prove that from a data science perspective, wealth had very little to do with whether people convert to becoming donors. But 2 is just like, there's a lot of data. And when we were in a hospital environment, that experiential data proved itself to be extremely valuable. And a lot of times AI just, it supports things that we already know. It validates assumptions that we already have. Kind of like, we know that we give to places that we know better, and so in a hospital, you quantify visits, inpatient, outpatient, number of visits, and departments and services. So that was really the beginning back in 2017. And in fact, I just wrote an article for Nonprofit Pro on the 5 evolutions of AI in fundraising, because I thought back a couple weekends ago. I'm like, man, what we were doing in 2017 is like archaic compared to what we're doing today. Like, it doesn't even look the same. It's like, it looks so different because the technology is so much more advanced and so much easier to use. And oh my gosh, like, doing what we were doing in 2017 is like, riding a bike on a gravel road, compared to like a freshly paved highway. Like, it's just, it's amazing to think what we did then, and the fact that it even worked. And it's not that long ago. I make it sound like it was 5 years ago, but it was like 5 years ago. And it's just, AI today doesn't even look remotely the same.
That's so interesting, Nathan. And I kind of compare that with the experience of many of the nonprofits that we speak to in the Donor Participation Project, which are, who are really at ground zero, right? And we're talking like about the challenges of the startup development shop, because it always feels like we're in startup mode, right? And you are just going, I mean, this feels like we're getting set up to have an industry of kind of, winners, and I don't want to say losers, right? But that some nonprofits may be left behind because of this kind of AI quick evolution.
Well, there's a really good, really good point to that. Harvard Business Review wrote an article about this years ago. It's super dated, but it was aimed at the private sector, and it was titled something like, "Those that wait to use AI may never catch up." And when you think about what AI represents, it's like compounding interest. So you invest in AI and it starts to learn. Well, Amazon has been learning about my behaviors every time I buy something, or every time I like something or share something, for how many years, so they know me intimately well. And we've seen this since we started with our first clients years back. We saw this thing where it was like a lot of distrust and like, well, it's scary and we don't know if it's going to work. And, in the very first iteration of a model, it's not a magic wand and it doesn't solve all your answers. But over time, it gets better and it gets better and it gets better. And there's this exponential learning. Truly, if you're truly using machine learning is the operative word. So this learning continues to grow and get better and better, to the point that if you invest 2 years of dumping data and retraining a model in machine learning, you never want to turn it off. Like, you're going to get to a point where you're like, no way, because I'm like, now I'm going back 2 years. But to your point specifically, is that if organizations wait and they just kind of put their head in the sand and just like, I'm going to wait until, maybe it's a fad, or maybe it's not real, or maybe it's not for me. When your competitors, quote unquote, and we don't really talk about competitors in nonprofit space, but others that are aiming to build connections with some of your same people, if they're doing this and they get to know your individuals better, it's going to show, and it's going to be very hard to catch up. There really is no catching up. Like, you have to start where you start, and then you do your best to compete essentially for those connections.
This is fascinating. And so what I'd like to connect everything we're talking about now is to your book, which you've co-authored. Somebody posted in the chat a second ago, if current trends happen for just another 30 years, there will theoretically be no donors left. That was John Biederman. Thanks, John.
I love John. Yeah, John, nice comment.
So, what did you find? Why did you start writing about it? And I have to say, AI, like the rest of our industry, has very often focused on optimizing from our current donor pool, which is kind of, going down a very narrow path. But I'd love to hear what you found and what moved you to write this book.
Yeah, and to be clear, the book is really not a book on technology. It's more than anything a call to action, which there is technology in the book around, 2 chapters around, kind of future state. We kind of look in a more utopian view of how AI can actually help develop and foster connection. But, it really started for me. I mean, I've always been like this eternal optimist. I mean, I grew up with very little. My dad left when I was young. My mom and my sister, we had a very tight family knit, had no money, but we always gave back. There was always, like, I volunteered at Habitat. I did my first fundraiser when I was 8 years old for autism. Like, I was in the newspaper in our local town, but like, so I've always had the strong affinity toward the power of philanthropy. And I guess with that, there's responsibility that comes with that. And I remember, just raising money and, with organizations and feeling like it was getting harder, but not really knowing why and not looking at the macro trends. But then in 2010, something happened that like really caught my attention. It was the signing of the Giving Pledge, and so you get Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are like, the big exciting thing that frankly, from a historical purpose, there hadn't been that much media attention on mega gifts since Rockefeller and Carnegie were essentially kind of competing against each other for big dollars and, and big wins. And so I kind of, this is not very sophisticated at the time, but I was very curious about that. And I actually, in 2012, I did a project when I was at CCS Fundraising, and it was, we had to present to our other consultants a topic that we found interesting. And I picked this topic of the evolution of mega gifts because I thought, well, at the end of the day, this Giving Pledge will have one of 2 effects. It will either inspire generosity at a large scale because now, we can see how polio could be eradicated and some other like very large scale things were able to be achieved through that. Or it would have the opposite effect, which was, essentially what we now talk about commonly as a crowding out effect. And this idea that, well, Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are on the scene, my gifts are not as needed. And it's obviously not that easy, but that was 2012 was really my start. And I really started tracking giving patterns, what I could find every year. Like, my team would make fun of me because Giving USA report would come out and I would calendar out a day that for no meetings. And I was like the total nerd of like, I go through and like read the footnotes and which I know a lot of people on this call do. And it's in the industry, we had very little data at that time. I mean, now with the Fundraising Effectiveness Project and with Donor Participation Project, there's a lot more attention on this topic now than there was, 2012. And we know that there needs to be more work and more study done. But I will say that watching this change, and I see some of the comments of, it's now routine that I'm having lunch with, a fundraiser. I had lunch with a fundraiser, a high-level fundraiser a few weeks ago. Said every year at this organization, they've either hit their goal or exceeded it, but from a shrinking pool of donors. And John's comment earlier in the chat, which is, where does this end? So I had to come to this thing of like, well, if we follow this trend, this negative trend of like the decreasing percentage of people giving to traditional charities, where does it end? And we modeled it out, and just because it's very easy to do, in 49 years, giving either ends or ends up in the single digits. And so I don't think we live in this world that we think is so generous that it could afford to be less generous. I don't think any of us want to raise our kids or our grandkids in a world where, people don't help each other. And so, I made a comment going back about 4 years ago I was talking at a conference in New York, and I'm like, well, someone needs to write a book, The Generosity Crisis, because the stuff is going on. And little did I know, because I really don't consider myself a writer, is that I ended up, no one wrote it and no one took me up. If someone had taken me up on that at the conference, I would have been so happy. Someone needed to write the book. So long story short is, this is more than anything, more than about AI. It's really a call to action. I view it as like, we need to get things going so that people understand that there's an issue.
Okay, great. So before going into this, the chat is on fire. I'm going to go back to a question. I just don't want to miss it. I think it was Stephanie earlier who asked, my org has a budget under 2 million. What does AI even mean for my organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. And finally, there's some answers for it. Because being an early adopter myself, I remember presenting at an AFP conference in San Diego when I was at UC San Diego years ago. And I was talking about AI, and someone raised their hand, and I'm like, yeah, but like I'm at a small organization. What does it mean to me? And honestly, the answer, this is horrible. Like at that time I had to answer. I said, it's not yet. Like, I'm sorry, like you're going to have to wait. The cost is so prohibitive. The technology is burdensome to get there. But I will say that a big part of the evolution of AI is decreased cost in computing power, decreased cost in big data. Is that like DonorSearch? I mean, a lot of organizations are using AI. DonorSearch offers free an AI model that we have this idea to re-envision the RFM score to be a modern day RFM score, which we call MLR, and it's free to all of our clients. And so if you're a small nonprofit, you can start to use AI. Now there's 31,000 flavors of AI, but you can start to use AI for even small shops and that score alone would be revolutionary 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Like it would have been like mind blowing, but now with when you compare that to full blown custom AI, it just gets better and better.
That's amazing. And, frankly, just any RFM score that were widely available to anybody would be an improvement.
Yeah.
So thanks for what you guys are putting out there. Lots of really good comments. And one of them touches on where I was hoping to ask you, which is how are we defining generosity? And I know there's lots of back and forth about that. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But people are really resonating with the idea of fundraising getting harder. The March of Dimes was mentioned, and we even had Rhonda who was working in it, right? But people not taking meetings, which is what I see also all the time, the traditional, hey, I'm in your area, I'd love to meet. And, in the past, people would say, oh, it's my son's wedding, come to it. Right now is like, don't even come close to us.
Yeah.
John mentions another issue that you reflected on, which was fighting for attention, right? So it's not only that we're fighting necessarily among nonprofits, it's the mind share of our donors, right? Is that kind of what you referred to when you mentioned Amazon and all those other companies?
Yeah, and this is I call it my 20-year epiphany. It's like I'm an early adopter, but man, a little slow to the uptake, I guess, with things like, at the end of the day, it really comes down to connection, right? At the end of the day, my 20-year epiphany was like, and when we saw it from a data science perspective, like what we're doing is quantifying connection in real time. So like people's connection changes over time. Well, we live in this world where our connection is being harvested like rapidly, but your connection is a finite, variable. Like you don't have unlimited connection, like truly, like you can't love every organization the same way or love every company the same way. You have a finite number of organizations that you can have that kind of visceral connection with. And it was interesting because I was listening to a podcast this weekend, and to Tocqueville, when he came, talked about this thing in the U.S. about affiliation, how Americans had this strong affiliation. And I would argue, while that was so unique at the time, where we had this responsibility to our community, that affiliation's not enough anymore. With TVs and the pocket computers that we have in our, that everyone has on them, being your phone, it's like, affiliation is not enough. It's really comes down to this connection, which is being, harvested at a high dollar value. And so, average person gets 333 emails a day. You see between 5 to 10,000 ad placements a day, anywhere where you're driving or looking online. Completely overwhelming. And I would argue that, we talk about this in the book quite a bit, is that corporations have gotten really good at understanding this. There are a lot of corporations that can speak very similarly to how nonprofits would speak, and they can draw, this connection. Elon Musk in a Twitter post yesterday talked about how he bought Twitter for the love of humanity. And he's said that before about Tesla and the Boring Company, that this is philanthropy. His companies are philanthropy. It's confusing. And I think nonprofits, there's a blurriness between nonprofits and corporations in the sense of that connection, and where if you're not just a traditional giver, like, what does it mean to be generous anymore?
Absolutely. And there's, companies that are talking about donor loyalty and engagement. And this happens to us at Almabase, where we sometimes will pull up like a vendor of a product that looks at these things, and they use nonprofit language 100%. They're talking about retention and engagement and trust and loyalty. It's amazing. It's a little bit like the for-profit sector has, starting with Facebook and all that, has kind of, I don't want to say infringed, but gone into that sphere that was traditionally exclusive for nonprofits. Would you describe it that way?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and actually I see Jeff's comment about there's a shift in what we've defined as generosity, and I think either there is, or there maybe there should be. Actually, when Elon posted, when he was interviewed by Chris Anderson from TED Talk last year, it was actually the number one viewed LinkedIn post I had all year, which was, if I buy a Tesla, does it mean I'm a philanthropist? And where he talks about this, and we hosted a panel with a few nonprofit leaders talking about, like, is the definition of philanthropy changing? And because, to Jeff's point of, like, there's so many other ways to give. Like, who would not admit that GoFundMe for my neighbor whose son is sick, or a husband passed, or is trying to pay for an operation or do something special, that's philanthropy. And only about 20% of GoFundMe, I believe, is actually going to nonprofits. Most of it is just going to the end user to help someone in need. I mean, that's really what we truly care about, if you really in the spirit of generosity. But I think there is a need to redefine, or at least publicly, for people to understand that generosity is not giving $1 to a tax deductible charity. Generosity takes on many forms, and we always talk about time, talent, and treasure, but it's always been, as long as it goes to my charity, versus, do we care about generosity in the world and living in a world that is more generous? Now, the argument is, from people who don't believe there's a generosity crisis, the argument is that people are just giving in other ways. That generosity has never been greater. This is a golden age of generosity. It's never been greater. And the only markers that we can really look at outside, because we can't measure a lot of that goodwill, are things like in the biggest indicators of, like, homelessness or food insecurity. Are those things on the decrease, or are they on the rise? And for the most part, they're not on the decrease. If we were living in the golden age of generosity, we would see massive declines in some of the main areas of vulnerability in around the world. And we know that's not the case. I mean, the world still has incredible need and suffering, and needlessly in a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, this whole conversation feels a little bit like the fundraiser who's not meeting their year-end goals, and then they start arguing that the goals were actually different. So I mean, yeah, I think the facts that you share show a crisis in generosity, in giving, at the very least, giving to nonprofits.
Right.
And
Right.
do you think we should be worried about that, or on the other hand, it's not so bad? Well, people can support Ukraine by booking an Airbnb.
Right. Yeah, I think we should be worried about it. I mean, I absolutely think that, not that we should discredit other ways to help. We should all be looking for the most really effective, efficient ways to help that, helps the end user at the end of the day. But as American generosity is really being challenged right now, I mean, I truly believe this is an inflection point, and those organizations, really need to think differently about their future. And no more spray and pray. I mean, I think so much of what is challenging the nonprofit sector is this lack of understanding that it really comes down to personal connection, and that it's just more is better. And I've been on the soapbox recently about this, like, more is better. More is not better. I actually had this a great debate, I guess we'll call it debate, with a CDO last week about more is better. And the CDO was like, more is better. I want more. And at the end of the day, not all donors are created equal. So a donor that stays with you is worth 15 to 16 times X of a donor that gives one time. So more is not better. Better is better, right? And so, like, how do you get more better? Is that you get to know people. I mean, the argument is it's not about convincing more people to come to church. It's about looking at the people that are there and getting to know them more intimately, which is a topic I had at a Catholic convention a couple of weeks ago. And it goes, most organizations have more constituents than they know what to do with if they really spent the time and focused on things like retention versus revenue. And I think, a lot of the theme on LinkedIn and with a lot of the articles is really around, Effectiveness Project is really, really, huge focus on retention. Well, and you have a huge, big focus on retention. Like, how do you keep people not for the short term, but how do you invest in relationships for the long term? That's not very hard. I mean, harder to do than to say. Easy to say, easy for people to understand. But at the end of the day, like, there's a complete misalignment, because I would argue that 99% of fundraising shops, their end goal of success is revenue, not retention. And I asked a group at AFP if people raise their hand if they knew what their retention was, and like 2 people in the entire group knew what their retention rate was. That's a problem. That means the motivations of success are misaligned with sustainable philanthropy.
Well, yeah, exactly. So you mentioned revenue. It's a focus on short-term revenue.
Right.
And I do have a little bit of a pet peeve with donor retention as a metric, because you can actually be losing donors and have a donor retention score that's going up. So, I mean, if we call it whatever, loyal donors, I think that makes the same point.
Yeah, you always have donor attrition, right? But you have to be able to bring in. You have to have it both ways. I mean, you have to bring in new people, but the motivation,
the right type of people,
right? The right type of people, and the KPIs have to be aligned in the right way, because I mean, this is fundraising for 20 years. Donors don't work on our calendars, right? They work on their calendar. And so when you're trying to mold a donor into your calendar so that you can hit a revenue goal, it's not in the best interest of the donor. It's essentially, it's actually making it challenging a relationship when you do that. So I just find very, very few organizations, and maybe this is the big wake up call, in our sector. It's not that it's the only goal, but motivating or aligning your KPIs that reinforce long-term relationships with the right people. That's a huge epiphany. Like that, like, it's just not done. And that has to come at the very top. And not even, like, in a lot of cases, like in hospital, the CDO works for the hospital president. Like, it has to come from the very top to acknowledge, like, what we care about is the future of a group of people that will be with us, not just today, but for years to come.
That's fantastic. And well, when I work, I use a dashboard that I work with clients on, and loyal donors is on it. But Rhonda is asking a really great question that relates to maybe I don't know if that's the second part in your book, because I'm dying to read it, and you're launching on November 15. So everybody is waiting with bated breath. But the solutions part, right? So is a solution that the current system needs disruption? And like, how would you interpret that?
Yeah, it's funny because so the book has really two main parts. The first is really just a call for attention. Most people don't spend any time during the day thinking about generosity ever. Like they don't think about their own personal philanthropy or their own generosity or others. Right. So that's the first part. The second part is really what we're and it's not prescriptive. It's really more of a broad idea of like it's focused on a connection. And there's two parts to that, because one is acknowledging that generosity is the manifestation of connection, not the other way around. So in our industry, I think so there is a part where we have to flip the pyramid, is that in our industry we've always thought, well, people are generous and then we're going to connect with them and then we're going to keep them alongside, but it's really the other way around. So you first have to acknowledge that connection is everything, and there are tools to essentially measure connection in real time. Yeah. But that means that you're going to have to get in the trenches and really get to know people and really what understands, what drives them. I think there are things like, rather than a feasibility study that measures a person's affinity toward an organization one time, to something that would be more of a perpetual feasibility study that is measuring people throughout an entire life of a campaign versus just one time at the beginning. So I think a lot of that disruption, it definitely requires disruption, first of all, but a lot of that disruption comes from rethinking what we think we know about connection, challenging our biases. We have so many biases about what makes a donor and what makes a prospect. I mean, we have to throw those away and really understand, one, the data science behind it, but then be willing to get in the trenches. Like, again, it's just not this, it's getting away from more is better. More is not better.
Well, I mean, more relationships, deeper relationships, more multi-channel. You're mentioning things that way.
Yeah, when I'm saying more is not better, that idea that many nonprofits think that if I got $1 from everyone in America, we'd be rich, and only 49.6% of Americans make gifts. So like, this is not a new concept, but the world is not your oyster. Stop fundraising like it is. Like, start getting deliberate and specific with people that aren't just going to give you one gift, but that are, look like the people that will go the distance with you. But I do think there needs to be a lot of change. There needs to be at the very top organizations that believe they're not willing to trade that short-term revenue for long-term relationships.
Absolutely. And it makes so much sense. One of these things that I don't know, it boggles my mind. Why not? When you look at the potential payoff of these relationships, we're not selling even something really expensive as a car. We're potentially getting $1 million gift down the line, right?
Right. I know. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's the lifetime value thing. I mean, so lifetime, we just did this great study internally. So our team has around $5.5 billion in transactions that we compute all the time. We just hit over 5.5 trillion calculations on our gifts. So like, we're computing a lot, and it's just exponential. And one of the things I woke up a few weeks ago and I was just interested in learning more about, if you're predicting givers based on not on revenue, not on wealth, but on, do they look like part of the 49.6%? Do they look like people that are going to stay with you? Those people will stay with you longer. And so like, in the top half of our files, our donors retain at 70%, which is like completely different than what most logistic regression models will just predict people that, again, will retain at 20% or 30%. So, and when you start looking at lifetime value, it's just a topic that we don't talk about in our industry. I mean, 20 years ago, I came from the private sector and started talking about ROI. And I was always afraid after leaving a conference that my car would be keyed, because I'd mentioned things like, what's the ROI on that? And people were just not ready for it. I think the same thing is today with lifetime value. There needs to be a lot more, not just an annual giving in direct response, but like, lifetime value is such an important topic because the motivations are aligned, the metrics are aligned if you're really looking at lifetime value, not at annual revenue.
That makes so much sense, and I think your ROI message came through, because when I joined the industry, I think it was part of the backdrop that I joined against. But let's kind of narrow this down to a few conclusions, recommendations that you found in the book. Obviously, connection leads to giving, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Is another part of it that nonprofits need to be smarter about measuring connection.
Yeah, and I think well, 100%. Like, we can measure connection now. Like, we have the same technology that Microsoft and Google and Amazon have. Like, measuring connection, down to the 10th decimal point, and then realizing that that connection changes every day. So every day I have the ability to make a gift somewhere or not, or watch a video on a website or not, or take a lunch with a gift officer or not. So I think one of those big evolutions is that we can't think about people in fixed. Like, people are an N of one. Like, every person is individual. There's no donors, there's no prospects, there's no better donors. They're all individuals that have a varying degree of connection to your organization, and that connection changes all the time. So one is really recognizing that people are very dynamic, and not reducing lots of bias that we have toward what makes a donor. I mean, most fundraising shops that we look at have been soliciting rich white men for a very long time, and their data sets are extremely biased toward rich white men, because that's the process that they had for so many years. And so it's time to get away from that, obviously, and reduce bias and be very conscious about reducing bias. At the end of the day, it's not that complicated. We call it radical connection in the book.
Okay.
Because this idea of attention or affiliation is no longer enough. That connection just means, like, well, I can know you or you can know me. But this idea of radical connection is, I know you and you know me. And so we have a framework in the book on what radical connection looks like. And honestly, if I was still in nonprofit, I would look at that framework and I would take it with me and build it into a scorecard. And then I would interview my donors and, like, where do you fall online of this? Like, I know you and you know me, or it's something that I just have a preference for, or it's something that I tell my friends about. Right. So it's not just, binary. It's not just like one or the other. If you can measure that affinity, and this doesn't have to be done through AI, this could be done literally just through a lunch, meeting with the donor, asking the right questions, you'll get to know people that really want to go the distance with you.
That's amazing. So what I'm boiling this down to is that there's a certain component of strategy that needs to come from the top. Connection leads to giving, not the other way around. But then you have to start working that into your processes. It's not good enough to just kind of, give lip service to, oh, we're all about relationships. Like, lots of, I hear that a lot. But it actually has to be a part of kind of your ongoing conversations with donors, things like that.
Yeah. I mean, we share this example in the book, but one of the worst things I've ever heard from a donor is, why do I only hear from you when you want more money? And at the same time, the language that we use in fundraising, and we're in big fundraising, is partnership. Always like, oh, we're not just asking for money. We want you to be partners with us. We want you to walk arm in arm with us. And, you're going to be part of, together. And then as soon as that person makes a gift, that partnership just, is challenged. And then, fundraiser, X, Y, or Z has an annual goal to hit next year. It's like, oh, do you want to give a gift again? Well, what was all that stuff about partnership you told me about? So it really is, there has to be, I think, alignment of metrics and KPIs and what the goals are of the organization to allow organizations to foster longer term relationships.
And at a very dumb level, and I hope you'll forgive me, Nathan, in just investing more on the stewardship side, right?
Yeah.
Potentially. I posted a link to your book. I hope that was okay. I know that I'm so excited. As soon as we hang up, I'm gonna buy a copy. But we have some really, so Rhonda, I hope we addressed your comment about language. So it's not only about the big theory, but also specifically when you go into conversations. And I think we might both agree. Kevin Kane is is reflecting on the fact that yes, this is all very nice, yada yada yada, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, my org is not making the budget this year if I don't find that money under a rock. How do you address that?
It's so hard. I mean, that's ultimately the real issue, right? Is that you have to feed the beast, and you've got to keep things going. You got to keep the lights on. I mean, I think for organizations, and putting on my consulting hat, you got to start somewhere. So you can't just flip the switch overnight, completely flip the pyramid, but you've got to
Yep.
start building out. I mean, at least to have some key metrics, to starting on what that, whatever you call it, retention or long-term relationships are. It's hard, and I do think that this deserves, a lots of hard conversation, like with boards.
Yeah.
Boards have to understand the generosity crisis is real. Like, it's getting harder for organizations, and where does this end up if we don't foster the right relationships that are going to stay with us for the long term?
That's so interesting. I think Clay Christensen, when he's talking about disruptive innovation, actually suggests that you try to keep these things as a side project that potentially is even in a different room or a
Yeah.
different building, right? It's a totally different.
This has to go to the very top, like to change this transactional way of fundraising, just feeding the beast. That more is better. Like, just get more dollars every year. There has to be real conversation about it. And in fairness, like, a lot of the data that we're talking about is still new. I mean, this is not like, I mean, the whole decline in civic participation, I guess, is chronicled in bowling alone. So it's been since World War II, but we haven't really had the evidence of how it's impacted philanthropy until recently. So there is an opportunity now to have these conversations, and bring people in to talk about it too. So it's not just you. It doesn't end well for anyone if we don't have real conversation about where this ends. I mean, the premise, the donor participation project, is built on this idea. Like, there's something afoot. We better start talking about it and thinking a little bit differently.
Yeah, and doing. I'm with you.
Yeah.
I'm with you, Nathan.
Yeah.
Teresa, 7 non-solicitation touch. I mean, I think like rules of thumb like this one,
Yeah,
can be helpful because of what we heard before from what do I do my org raise it, is an under $2 million, like just kind of boiling this down, no?
Yeah. So right. But how many organizations have a metric for those 7? Like, gift officers will work toward their metric if they, being competitive individuals. But I 1,000% believe in this. Like, if you have 7 non-solicitation touches between asks, like, oh my gosh, like, I feel heard. Like, I feel like you actually meant what you said when you said you wanted to be a partner. Like, you just wanted to check in. I'm on a board for a grassroots nonprofit called the Farmling Project. And during COVID, it was college students that started out. They're amazing, amazing. One of my friends, who is also a consultant, she made a gift. She called me. She goes, I just got a call. She made like a $50 gift. She goes, I just got a call from this person at the Farmling Project just thanking me for their gift. She goes, in all my years, I had never had that. Like, I mean, it doesn't take a whole lot. It's not rocket science. This idea of radical connection. People want to feel heard. They want to feel like they're part of the tribe, that you're together in something. You could do something together that you couldn't do alone.
Absolutely. Let's go into leadership and what you're finding, Nathan, as you share this message. And you mentioned your conversation with the More is Better leader, but I'm sure you're finding different reception around there as you talk to people about this. Jay is sharing that yes, boardrooms very often ask, they're kind of in this one mode, and it's served them well for, I don't know, several decades, but it doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, on the board, I will just say I've been really honored to be able to come into some board meetings and do a presentation kind of on the state of philanthropy. And it's enlightening, because they're not used to those like more macroeconomic, they board members tend to like to be problem solvers. They're not used to that. They tend to start hearing things internally, and trust me, I know, like, as excuses, like, well, why we're not going to hit it. Well, right now it's all about inflation and recession, and it's like, well, how's it going to affect our fundraising? And you have to position yourself for success, right? But board members hear that as, well, that's just an excuse. You just got to focus more, whatever.
More.
Yeah. But I think there are a lot of great resources now that never existed before, like like what you're doing, and like Fundraising Effectiveness Project, the Generosity Commission, that are, it's not just you anymore. It's not just like, me saying it's getting harder, we're in it together. I think there's an opportunity to bring board members alongside to start really, frankly, it's more aligned with what more board members would want, which is getting to know less people more intimately, and really challenging them to do that versus just saying, we're just trying to, fill a bucket.
Yeah.
A leaky bucket, if, for that matter.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so Nathan, I'm so very grateful. We'll give one last chance for folks to ask questions or to share reflections. But if people want to connect with you, where should they head? I already posted the link to your book on Amazon. Where else can they learn about you and your research?
Yeah, well, LinkedIn is one of my, for whatever, I bet on the right horse years ago when I thought LinkedIn was like I don't do a lot of social media, but I love LinkedIn. I love my LinkedIn community. So definitely, look me up there, connect with me. I'm honestly, I love our sector. I believe in the power of philanthropy. Like I love anyone who believes that same way. So I'm really truly the kind of person that if I'm in your city and you send me a note or let me know, like, let's get coffee. Like I just, I don't know. I feel like this doesn't happen alone, and there's comfort in numbers. And so I'm so impressed with what you've done. Again, I keep on saying this, but like bringing together, you've activated a group of people who really care and starting to really look at the future. And it's so inspiring. And so whatever I could do to contribute to that, let me know.
Thank you, Nathan. And if you keep doing this, we're going to run out of t-shirts. So please, and actually for everybody, this is a really ugly t-shirt that I ordered. So we'll come up with something to do that. Nathan, this has been absolutely great. Final comments from Allison, who's another great member of the DPP. There's value in partnerships. Lots of folks who are excited about the conversation. If you're new to the Donor Participation Project, because we were so very, very generously covered by the Chronicle of Philanthropy and a great article by Drew Lindsay.
Yeah. Awesome.
Welcome. This is a group today. It's more, it's more us and, in the chat, but usually our monthly sessions are more interactive. We want to hear from you. And really, this is an issue that we all need kind of to pitch in and problem solve together. Because even if we have the great research that Nathan is sharing, it really boils down to how are you in your nonprofit going to implement this? And there's a lot of just emotional, tactical stuff that we can deal with. So,
and congratulations on the article. That was amazing. Several friends sent it to me, and I was just cheering you on. That was amazing. And Drew is a great guy. He just covered it so well. I will, if I could just comment on Allison's comment. We didn't talk about this idea of partnership, but I do think that there's an opportunity for nonprofits to partner in unconventional ways. They're going to have to. There are corporations and things, the rise of B Corps, so on, yada, yada, yada. Mm-hmm. Nonprofits have to get past their own ego and get creative and really work together in unconventional ways. So thanks for posting that, Allison. I think that's a great comment that deserves a lot more conversation.
Really important stuff that you shared. Great learning opportunity for me and for I hope for some others. And folks, connect with Nathan, check out his book, and we'll see you in our next event. Take care.
Thank you so much.